like, it's pretty obvious, but also easily overlooked fact that when we're talking about how to teach diverse learners, people are bringing different bodies of knowledge to that conversation. So we have to begin by recognizing that there's more than one way that people conceptualize the responsibility to respond to diversity in schools, and that they will bring different arguments and claims to the table, and that every one of those claims can be critiqued. And that brings us to the second body of knowledge that we draw upon in our interdisciplinary work, and that's the framework of epistemic cognition.
The concept of epistemic cognition asks us to think about how teachers think about knowledge and about ways people gain knowledge. When we say epistemic, we mean that individuals seek to make sure knowledge is accurate and justified. So it's not just about learning information, but interrogating and deep understanding of knowledge, and this is really important in diversity education. Over the last 50 years or so, research in the field of educational psychology has helped us to understand more about how we think about knowledge and knowing, and how this can have an impact on teaching and learning generally. For example, if someone holds black and white views about knowledge and knowing, this is sometimes referred to as objectivist epistemic beliefs, the chances are they're going to think that knowledge is a given and it's just waiting out there for someone to transfer into their brains. So you don't need to think critically about this sort of knowledge because it already exists and it's right, so to speak. This is a bit troublesome when it comes to thinking about diversity education, because we don't want pre-service teachers simply absorbing information about how to teach diverse groups of children from their teacher educators or from their supervising teachers on professional experience placement. And we also don't want pre-service teachers simply relying on their own gut experiences or personal experiences as a way of knowing and constructing knowledge. This is a view of epistemic cognition that's been called subjectivist in nature, and it involves knowledge being simply personally constructed. So like the black and white view of knowledge, there's no need to think critically. These experiences are not evaluated in the light of other ideas or perspectives and evidence. And this view of knowledge and knowing is also troublesome when it comes to thinking about pre-service teachers and diversity education.
Perhaps a risk with teaching is that sometimes in thinking about different groups or diversity within a classroom, is that as teachers we tend to draw on our personal experiences to inform our practice, and on one hand that can be really useful and beneficial, but it can also be hindering in some way, shape and form, because our personal experience with one, in the case of students with intellectual disabilities, our experience with one student with intellectual disability does not necessarily equate to us being able to skillfully craft learning experiences for every every student who has an intellectual disability moving forward. And so I think developing knowledge in a range of ways is going to be really important for diversity, not just our personal experience, but understanding as best as we can. I use the word absolute, and I think that's a really powerful word to try and wrap our heads as best as we can around what's available right now, knowing that knowledge will continuously change, but what's available now that we can use to inform our practice. And again, so that our young people, our students, our pre-service teachers can have the best learning experience that they can.
While we know personal experiences can be important, it's clear that a teacher who simply goes by their gut reactions and or personal experiences without some sort of critical reflection is going to come up short when it comes to supporting diverse groups of children and their families.
So I went to school in a school that had a separate, it was called an opportunity school. So now it would be a special education unit. So there was the main school, and then there was a separate, smaller building where students with disability went. So it used to be the infant school in my school, and then that was changed, and they put up a fence, a huge fence. Kids with disability were behind the fence. We were outside the fence. We never had anything to do with those kids, and we were frightened of them. And I'm deeply ashamed to say we called those kids oppos. So for me, this journey and this this work, it comes from experiences that I hope will become less and less as we become more aware of this. So I have to unlearn and be constantly reflecting on my own understanding, because I grew up with those messages that people belonged behind a fence.
A pre-service teacher who sees knowledge and knowing as both personally constructed and evidenced based through critical reflection is then able to bring together different knowledge claims, experiences, biases, stereotypes in a way that supports teaching for diversity. This is what we call an evaluative stance. We don't just take knowledge, we evaluate it. We evaluate competing sources of knowledge through processes of weighing up and making informed judgments. It's not simply a process of absorbing information or procedures. We engage, we reflect, we make conscious decisions. This is epistemic cognition at work in diversity education.
My teacher education students, I often ask them to be critical consumers of knowledge. They are the, I suppose, recipients of knowledge and the experience of going through a teacher education course. But I'm asking them to be mindful of, well, who constructed that knowledge? Okay, and even when we look at policies, and my area is interest in policy enactment. So if there is a policy from an education system that you as an educator, you as a teacher needs to respond to in the classroom, how do you negotiate that? Are you just going along with the party line, or are you looking at that and going, where's this coming from? What does it mean for my learners? What does it mean for me as a teacher? What does it mean for the broader community in which I work? So, and then having those conversations, it's not like, being a radical, but it's challenging that knowledge that is packaged and presented as the knowledge, but you as a teacher is always unwrapping that little package. So many layers of paper and wrapping and what's inside, and then you need to look at that and go, right, what does this mean? What does the research tell me? What does professional dialogue with colleagues tell me? And also being reflexive around that throughout that process, so that you can then authentically respond to that knowledge construction. But at the end of the day, you're the interpreter of knowledge for your learners, whether that's curriculum, whether that's policy, your own profession, that this is what teachers do.
So I firmly believe that diversity can be interwoven into curriculum units, and they shouldn't entirely be divorced from that other standpoint of, just being about syllabi and documents and, full stop, basically. And one good example would be, women's histories, for example. So one of the assessment tasks in the unit was to build a program for Depth Study 6, which for New South Wales is basically a pick your own adventure kind of thing. Really sharp one, looked at the Australian context quite heavily, and basically looked at the historiographical approaches to women and how they've been developed and changed over time. So it was targeted to a gifted cohort, but what we're able to encourage and build on with that student is engaging with those multiple perspectives, breaking open the perspectives that, perhaps like a bad bottle of wine that should have been drunk 20 years ago, should be left in the past, as well as allowing and building the critical analysis and evaluative skills in the students to build on the perspectives that they agree with, many of which for that student, the way that they chose to approach that unit were very recent. Gillard's misogyny speech, for example, and looking at positive female leaders, and how people like Jacinda Ardern are being written about, for example, or what impacts the writings of Hillary Clinton had on her election loss, or did that have a say, kind of thing. So there is absolutely a space there for that. Another example was I had a unit that was developed on Indigenous histories, and specifically looking at massacres in the the metropolitan Sydney area. So that includes Eora, Dharawal, Durrag, Ku-ring-gai, Camaragal, a few other mobs as well. They're probably the main mobs in Sydney. And basically, that student was able, even in some of the discussions we were having in class about, how do you build a unit, what's it like to work in a team to build a unit, we did ask them to build a unit on their own, so they have that skill in case of, being in a small school where they're the history teacher. But ideally, of course, as we know, it should hopefully be in a team, but a lot of those discussions allowed the students to drive some of that knowledge forward and contribute to the broader group that, you don't just have to do the Vietnam War.
Epistemic cognition is more than just learning something, right? Not everything, according to Alexander and a few other theorists, rises to the level of being epistemic in nature. And she argues that to be epistemic, there needs to be a focus on seeking the accuracy and the veracity of knowledge and justifying knowledge. So, for example, I could mindlessly learn how to do my times tables as a child. That's not epistemic because I haven't engaged in actively seeking knowledge, justifying knowledge, making sure it's accurate.
Because I wonder whether epistemic cognition isn't necessarily separate from learning, but it's a process that occurs in a deeper level of learning, as opposed to rote learning times tables or tying your shoelace, perhaps. Maybe some of those more rote style processes aren't necessary. They're not epistemic, they don't require epistemic cognition, but there are deeper levels of learning that do, and that I'm thinking of argumentative reasoning as a process that relates to epistemic cognition that still results in some sort of learning outcome, but it's a deeper, more complex learning outcome, right, which we're trying to achieve.
It makes sense that epistemic cognition influences what we think and do in diversity education because it's about the core of knowledge and knowing, which is at the very heart of teaching and learning. We teach in ways that we think we know will work. We teach the knowledge we believe is valuable. But often those beliefs and assumptions are subconsciously adopted or passed on from one person to another and reproduced without any conscious thought. In our project, we've identified the benefits of thinking deliberately about epistemic cognition. Clark Chin and his colleagues have given us some useful language to help with this work. They talk about epistemic aims, ideals, and reliable processes as ways to think about epistemic cognition in the everyday classroom teaching and learning experience. The first part of the framework relates to the epistemic aims, and they're just our intentions for pre-service teachers about what sorts of knowledges and ways of knowing we want them to engage in. So for example, you might have an epistemic aim of wanting pre-service teachers to acquire knowledge about diverse groups of kids. Or you might want them to actually do something with that knowledge and evaluate and justify perspectives around, for example, teaching to diverse groups. So, for example, a teacher educator who thinks pre-service teachers should have an evaluative aim about diversity education might think that they need to go beyond just listing off facts about children who might have diverse needs in their classroom to thinking about whose facts are they? Where do these claims come from? Whose claims are they? Was anyone consulted about these so-called truths? So these sorts of questions relate to a different type of epistemic aim that are more evaluative in nature. I just wondered if you could share some of your experiences of thinking about epistemic aims with trauma-aware education.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the really important pieces of helping pre-service teachers understand the effects of trauma is helping them understand about the effects of trauma on the brains and bodies of their students that they might have. And one way that I help them sort of interrogate that and maybe shift their mindset and change their thinking around how to address the needs of a student who's been affected by trauma is just to go beyond just looking at the student and saying, well, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? To understanding more, or what has happened to you in your life and why. So you sort of getting them to interrogate that knowledge of what's or interrogate the behaviour of what we see on the surface and try to dig a little bit deeper to understand that.
Great. So that aim that you have for your pre-service teachers is clearly about questioning and interrogating rather than accepting, which is more an acquiring of knowledge.
Yeah.
Bringing epistemic cognition and knowledge of diversity together to analyse classrooms and schools can be helped by the concept of reflexivity. A knowledge of the difference between evaluativist and objectivist aims helps us recognise when people are teaching about diversity or catering to diversity or actively advocating for diversity, for change. Because advocating for diversity, like transforming the world, requires an evaluative epistemic stance, an evaluative epistemic aim, which supports the critique, the identification, the critique, the problematization of things that have been taken for granted, things like the curriculum that we use and the pedagogies that we adopt. It requires us to question knowledge that has been privileged, passed down, become normalised in teacher education programs. It requires interrogating assumptions that have just stood unquestioned in order to see who wins or loses in a particular context because of our assumptions. So that transformative work is an ongoing process, and understanding that process is enabled when we develop and display epistemic reflexivity.